These are fundamentally intangible things.
Yeah.
But when it's right, you will succeed. And when it's wrong, you will fail. And I can't tell you necessarily why.
Raal, welcome to Undocked.
Yes. Hi, Nick. Good to see you. It feels like
It's been a while.
It's been a while. We've been putting out quite a lot of content, pre-recorded content, let's say. So to everyone else, it probably looks like we've kind of
We're super busy. Yeah.
Well, no, but we've been continuing uninterrupted, but we've actually not done one of these where it's just been you and me for a while. So I've been looking forward to it.
I actually can't think when the last one was. Was it before shipping week? No, it was just after shipping week, wasn't it?
It was our hangover edition of LISW hangover editions. Yeah. And
it's been far too long without you.
Yeah. And you've had some adventures. I've had some of my own, but I think you've been pretty much nonstop on a plane.
I've been Singapore. I was flattered to be asked to give the keynote presentation at the Kaleris APAC Customer Summit, which is bringing together their customers in container terminals and their customers on the container carrier side. And it was a really interesting couple of days. Such a fascinating market because you've got container ships running through terminals every single day, thousands of containers going on and off the terminals every single day. And yet the amount of time carriers and terminals actually spend talking to each other outside of that is minimal. So it was really interesting to get those two groups in a room together to talk about how things could work better. So that was really good fun. So Kaleris are they're a Thetis client, but they're a private equity backed supply chain execution platform that focuses on the maritime sector. So they acquired Navis about 5 years ago, the container terminal operating system, and they've made 5 or 6 other acquisitions since. But Navis was kind of the core platform. So they've gone from being a terminal operating system to more of a wider supply chain execution and visibility platform. And so, it was all the stakeholders around that, which is, as I said, it's both terminals and carriers.
I always find that the ones where everyone that's in the room is part of a kind of an ecosystem that requires, each other to work together in quite close-knit collaboration, because it immediately makes it a much more focused kind of discussion, I think. One of the things that's interesting as well about what you're saying there is this is a specific sector, the container sector. One of the things that I think is coming under the spotlight much, much more at the moment is the needs of different sectors. Because I think what we're looking for typically in the industry, a lot of the discussions on the really big stuff are kind of cross-sector. And I think that as we get to, and we'll talk about this in today's episode, ladies and gentlemen, there are big decisions being made that will affect cross-sectors. But I think as we're getting to the pinch point of that, I think different sectors are starting to kind of come out a little bit and say, but we have different considerations to everyone. The container sector is probably the thing that has changed world trade the most profoundly in hundreds of years, really. So I'd like to let's sort of maybe educate people about that a little bit, and then what's happening in the container sector right now. Where are their big concerns and focus? Today's episode is brought to you by Orbit MI. In shipping, fuel is money. Orbit MI helps you use less of it. Their optimization solutions improve routing, speed management, and emissions performance, helping you cut costs while staying sustainable. Imagine saving fuel and reducing emissions without sacrificing operational efficiency. That's the Orbit MI way. Built on AI and made for the connected maritime era, Orbit MI delivers results fleet-wide, smarter voyages, stronger margins, greener operations. Learn more at orbitmi.com/connected-maritime-era.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to your point on transformation, people talk about maritime as being an industry that hasn't been disrupted for thousands of years, but that's actually not true. The container over a 50-year period completely changed how the industry functions, and a lot of the older general cargo operators are no longer in existence because of the container. And there's only 10 large carriers, I think, do something like 85% of all container slot capacity. So you're talking about a highly consolidated market. Probably 2 big areas of concern at the moment that came across. One is the general attitude globally towards globalization and trade at the moment is creating a huge amount of uncertainty. With what's going on in the US, it's very, very difficult to commit to making a massive infrastructure investment when you don't actually know what the trade flows are going to look like in 3 months, let alone in 3 years or 30 years. So that's a massive one. And then the other kind of classic one that kept coming up and always comes up, and it just amazes me that across every sector we've never been able to quite work out how to fix it, is making just-in-time arrival, berth optimization, all of that stuff work. And that's, probably one of the biggest friction points between the carriers and the terminals is making that work and making the actual experience on the berth as efficient as possible. It's always the same issues that we seem to come back to.
The other thing that I find really interesting about container industry is the sort of diversity of the customer base. Mainly because of the compartmentalization of it. Like, you can order a container.
Yeah, you can go online and book one to be dropped off at your house from China.
Yeah, if you buy a car somewhere, you might want to put it in a container and bring it over. Yeah. You might be, I guess, relocating houses and stuff. So, and pieces, and you can get bits of containers as well. So it's kind of like much more sort of many more considerations are really around sort of how that works. The other thing that's interesting about it as a market, I think, as well, is particularly when it comes to decarbonisation, the original story around that was that because liner trade is more predictable, people are going from A to B, they tend to be fairly established routes, that was going to be a much easier thing to approach from a new fuels perspective, because there would be that predictability, and therefore you could build a terminal, ensure that there was the fuel availability at that terminal, and sort of control that to a certain extent, But of course, you just referenced there, globalization has suddenly made that also much less predictable in terms of what trade routes, ladies and gentlemen, for example, may be opened or closed, and therefore also into a bit of uncertainty. Uncertainty is probably going to feature in today's title, I think. But yeah, very, very interesting to get into these kind of type of events. And obviously, if you're not a customer, you wouldn't really, or involved, you wouldn't necessarily get in there. And you gave the keynote. So what was your subject for the keynote?
It was all about how to make collaborative innovation work. So, the kind of main problem we were presented with is these two stakeholder groups collaborate all the time, day in, day out, on really, really operational issues. But how do you get out of that and get to the point where you can look for ways to make drastic improvements that might transform the operations? Yeah, so it's a really interesting topic, because I think in so much of our day-to-day life, we just end up doing the same things over and over again, and actually like creating the conditions to be able to stop and or think about the best ways to improve things is something that I think everyone would benefit from, but no one really does. No one really takes the time to do in practice. So yeah, it was interesting.
Yeah, well, again, and I think this is something that we come back to, isn't it, over and over again? Like, nothing is actually the way you would design it now, starting now with today's technology and circumstances. So it's trying to work out how you can kind of move things forward without kind of major disruption as well, because anything that we do in this industry typically is changing the tires while the car's in motion, which can be very tricky. So yeah, a fascinating topic. How did it go down? Well, were you well received?
I think yeah. Good. It's always difficult to tell from within. People are always very polite to your face.
But I do love a keynote. I love a keynote because you can be very sure that no one else is going to say what you have planned.
Yeah, that's very true.
You speak first. There's nothing worse, is there, than like waiting for your turn to speak, and then somebody's just
crossing stuff out.
Good 5 minutes of your session. It's just that's yeah. And so that was one. That was one of your many trips. So that was over in Singapore. And then where was next on the tour?
Well, I had a little family holiday in between, which was very nice. So I spent a few days in Marrakesh, and then I went to Daman in Saudi Arabia for the Saudi Maritime and Logistics Congress, which was a really interesting show. I've only done it once before, and it seems to be growing massively year on year, along with kind of the whole Middle East region. But I was there to take part in a debate on whether it's been interesting. I'll pose this question to you, Raal. I'd be interested to know which way you would vote. Well, artificial intelligence lead to less competence in the maritime industry?
Well, I don't wish to duck the question, but I mean, I think it very much depends on the definition of competence, right? And this is not something that's just something being discussed in maritime. When you look at schools, there is this, on the one hand, in the education system, this sort of fear that we must make sure that people aren't dependent on machines for everything. So they're able to do arithmetic, they're able to remember facts, remember, swathes of information, trying to persuade those that they're educating with this, who are living a reality in which they can access information all of the time, almost always uninterrupted. And so, so you do find yourself kind of thinking, I guess if I was to be very lofty about it, I would sort of suggest we are perhaps entering into a kind of more of a cyborg era for humanity, where where you haven't had the computer kind of inserted in your brain, but it's always in your pocket or on your wrist, and so you can continually access it, and it is an extension of your capabilities. And the reason that's, when it comes to competence, as you know, it's a big passion of mine, training and education. In the old days, you were front loading everything as far as your education was concerned. And I think we already sort of moved beyond that because of the pace of change. It's not unusual now for seafarers to go on courses sort of continually to either top up, refresh, learn something new that's coming to the market. Particularly, there's also now a whole school of thought. You could think about things slightly differently as far as manufacturer stuff is concerned, because that's so integral to running some of the ships now, having sort of considering that to be part of the education process too. But I think where I'm going with my thoughts on training is that all of that will evolve, all of that will continue, it will change in ways by the opportunities of technology and by the pace of change that's coming through. But I think there's a really interesting bit around in-work enablement, which is kind of shaping up now and is massively going to be transformed by AI. Because if you think about how people use ChatGPT versus how they use browser search, right, to find information, it's a very different thing. We have a fundamental problem with education in seafaring at the moment, and it's volume. It's the sheer amount of volume of things that people need to know and learn and understand, that if we can move to using things like AI, in-work support for information processing to extend the human's capability, then the competence that you're looking for is the competence to use that effectively and be that super worker that we've talked about in earlier episodes, and we'll, I'm sure, come back to. So that was a very, it's a good job I wasn't on your panel, because I probably would have hogged the mic for quite a long time. So I think it's a difficult one. I think that technology is in danger of making people more stupid without the technology. But if we are thinking that there's never going to be a point at which human beings won't be augmented by technology, then we have less of a problem.
I was arguing against the motion. So I was arguing that AI will not lead to less competence. And I'm very competitive, and I'm pleased to say we won the debate. But you hit the nail on the head with your opener. That was exactly kind of where the debate ended up going. There were 6 speakers, and a lot of quite heated at points discussion towards the end was around the definition of competence. And I think the conclusion I came to was that if you don't use these tools, you are more at risk of becoming incompetent than if you do, if that makes sense. Like, I think we're going to get to a point where it becomes such an integral part of work and life that it's you have to learn to embrace these tools and learn to use them with competence.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion at the moment where we start to see problems of terminology, things that we've used in the past. And training is a very good example of that. Training is a word that becomes increasingly problematic, as does kind of competence, in the sense that, training, when we talk a lot about training, a lot of what we're talking about these days as far as training is concerned isn't really training. It's knowledge building, it's learning. It's not, you're not training to be able to do something, you're increasing your abilities and your skills. So I think that when you think about soft skills, which is one of the things that's obviously now becoming more and more foundational, I don't think you're not training someone to get through an exercise or a procedure or whatever. It's much more open-ended than that, and it's much more esoteric, I suppose. And, so I think there's a whole bunch of the terminology which probably warrants some investigation, and competency is right up there, because you can ask 5 people and you'll get different definitions. But I do worry that the reliance on AI could lead to people being unable to do stuff on their own. I think coming back to your motion thing, I did one last year at Crew Connect, and they asked me to do it, and they said, "Would you want to be for or against?" I said, "I don't really care." I'll be like,
"Oh, either way."
I could go either way on it. It's a bit like sort of. I said, I'll be like Boris Johnson with Brexit. Sort of whatever is more opportune at the moment. I'll just kind of go with that. But no, because I think you can see things through either lens, but I think it's quite interesting with technology and dystopic views of what's going to happen and stuff. I think it's a really great litmus test of whether people are foundationally optimistic or pessimistic. Like if you start talking to people about AI, you sort of uncover that quite quickly.
Interestingly, the room was a 50-50 split at the beginning of the debate, and it ended 60-40 against the motion. Right at the beginning, when the people were first asked, it was like the room was literally divided into 50-50 optimists and pessimists.
Yeah, I think as well, the other thing that I've found with the AI debate is that very often the mistake people make is they kind of think it's about being for or against AI, right?
Yeah.
But that's not the motion. That wasn't the motion.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The motion is what's fundamentally going to change. And I think once people get into that mindset, they don't want to be, if they're sort of tech focused and want to be sort of seen to be kind of, progressive, they'll just go and vote for it, whatever, and without really thinking about what the motion actually
the implications of it. Yeah.
But there is no point debating about whether or not AI is a good idea. It's already here.
It's happening.
So, but I think sort of thinking and forming viewpoints around what it's actually going to do and how it's going to change. I've been sort of doing a bit of reading and listening to various other companies and how they're approaching AI. Do you remember a few weeks ago, we were talking about, I can't remember again, because I think I said I could be persuaded other way. But the question that we were asking was, should companies have an AI strategy, or should they have a, it's just a tool. It's just part of any kind of technology.
Yeah.
So I've kind of kept that in my mind, really. And I'm seeing a lot of people who are falling on having a specific strategy around it. And the reason for it is exactly the reason that you and I think, discussed at the time. There's a very big need to pull more stakeholders from across the business into any discussions that are fundamentally about AI. The big one is the human resources, or the equivalent factor within it. And part of that is indeed down to the way in which workers are feeling and about the transformation that's going there.
Interestingly, let me give you a stat or a stated goal that I picked up on my travels recently. That I was speaking to a ship owner with a fairly large fleet, and they told me that their plan is to increase the size of the fleet by 25% over the next few years with no additional shoreside headcount. And so I think that kind of speaks to the rubber meeting the road on some of this stuff. Like that is what the reality actually looks like for potentially what's possible. Who knows whether it will work or not, but that's their kind of stated aim.
This is the thing about where the proof of the pudding is, and where a lot of you mentioned the rubber hitting the road. So we talked about some weeks ago around the hiring freezes that were happening in the US. The budgets moving from, right, we need to put in place all this infrastructure things for AI. And that money is coming directly from people. So hire freezes are being a thing. And I believe, I should have written it down, I believe that same trend is now being observed in the UK around new hires. So it's not people being laid off, but they're not opening up the new hire positions in anticipation that they won't need as many people when this comes in. Interesting. I also will perhaps come back to it, but I also conducted a webinar quite recently around this, and it was with a company, Norden. We're talking about some of the customers that they have, particularly around their carbon insetting program. And the two companies that they mentioned as being sort of new customers were, what would it be, Alphabet as being customer. And I was like, what are these guys ship?
Yeah.
How would they possibly be able to get into the carbon, insetting program on a logistics chain from that? Any ideas what it is? I was like, is it Mark Zuckerberg shipping Meta
shipping
headset?
his Meta glasses?
No.
I would guess it. So it's.
Sorry, it wasn't. It wasn't. It was Meta and Microsoft.
I would guess like data center equipment or something like that.
this is why you're giving the keynote, right? You're the man. No, absolutely right. The building of data centers, huge,
Wow.
amount of stuff going on. And this is obviously where, we talked about what we could see in the spending, and the fact that this is going into, that division between CapEx and OpEx, because this is where the money is going in. It's capital expenditure. It's building out big data centers, which require huge amounts of power and water and all that. So it's affecting the way that's looked at there.
Do you know what I saw recently about a week ago, which I thought was quite cool? Jeff Bezos talking about his kind of prediction for where data centers will end up. Obviously, AWS is the biggest provider of cloud infrastructure in the world. They have a huge amount of data centers. He thinks most of the data centers in the world will end up in space.
Well,
and they will end up on a low Earth orbit.
Katy Perry going to be involved somehow. Pop up there once in a while to entertain the troops or something.
You got to find a reason for building those rockets, and it's apparently it's data centers.
It's very cold up there, which is helpful, isn't it?
Very cold, and solar power is constant, 24 hours a day, constant access to clean energy. And then when you take into account Starlink, Kuiper, all of these low Earth orbit satellite, you've got them. You can connect them straight to the internet. So just happy days. You now no longer need your data centers using energy ashore on Earth.
Yeah. Yeah, wow, the new shore. That's brilliant. I mean, that is fascinating. Yeah, interesting. See how that one develops. But, that also ties in when you were saying the other day, you were talking about those licenses that Elon Musk was buying up frantically. Things, because again, you start relying on data in space, it's a very different, but potentially as well, when we talk about geopolitics, we talk about anything relating to cables and all that sort of stuff is threatened, is possible to be tampered with and cut off and all those sorts of things.
True.
So it's
very true
from that point of view as well. So who knows where that will end up. So that was Saudi, and you and I were together in UAE, in Dubai, back in March.
Oh yeah, back in March. Yeah.
Obviously, big differences between Dubai and Saudi, but you mentioned yourself as a region. Sort of big takeaways there in terms of things that you see going on?
Saudi seems to be changing very quickly. I've been there 2 years in a row now, and it does seem to, even in that time, it felt very different from one trip to the next, just in terms of how it seems to be trying to open up to the world and modernize. And so that's, I guess, fairly interesting. In the UAE, though, I had a conversation with the team at Sharjah Maritime Academy, and their last intake of cadets was 50-50 male and female, which I don't think I've seen anywhere else in the world at all, full stop. And so I think there's lots of reasons to be skeptical about things like women's rights out in the Middle East, but I was genuinely shocked in a good way that they'd managed to achieve that. And that they'd set it as a stated goal as well.
And actually the events as well were very well represented as well, with lots of very smart women in very good positions, making big differences in companies there. So it is one of the success stories, I think. So that was the second leg of the trip. You're now just about to head off to the US.
Yeah, I'm doing another keynote actually at the Crew Success Summit in Miami, which I'm looking forward to. So that is a similar kind of customer summit type event. That's been put on by Ripple Operations. Obviously, we interviewed Heather, the CEO, a couple of weeks back. So I think that episode should be coming live in the next week or two. But yeah, it should be a really interesting event. The talk I'm giving there focuses on autonomy, AI, and alternative fuels, and how those three things together will fundamentally transform crewing over the course of the next decade or so. So there's some, I think, big changes coming down the track, not just in terms of the day-to-day life of crew, but also in terms of how they're managed by the shoreside operation and then the wider context that the ships will sit in when it comes to alternative fuels.
Yes. And there was a very good chat that we had with Heather, and I think people will enjoy that. And I think one of the things, just for people to understand in the context of what you were just saying there, so Ripple have put together a number of different pre-existing sort of brands, systems, what have you.
Yeah, Adonis HR, Marine Learning Systems. Ripple itself was like a piece of ops software.
Yeah.
Marine CFO. I think it's 5 or 6.
Five or six that she talks about on the episode, so there's no need for us to get into it here. But they that then sort of mean more broadly number of different touch points with the sort of crewing side of things. So I think, and as you well know, I agree with you entirely on the idea of this being a major area of where we're going to see a lot of changes. And there's just lots of opportunities, I think, because we haven't looked at people in that operational data sense. It's not been something that's really kind of been, I don't want to say exploited. It's more a case of, looking at the correlations, I think, between what's happening with the people side of your business with the other side of it. So, but maybe when you get back from there, we could sort of maybe dig in and that
Yeah.
we can maybe dig into that, because there's quite a lot of things certainly that I've been doing, researching and so on, that I could bring to the table into that part of the discussion as well. So you mentioned a couple of things there which kind of I could use as a segue into my own adventures.
It's about to say that I've been traveling, but so have you. And not only have you been traveling, but you've got news.
Yes.
Haven't you?
Well, it's like a lot of things in life.
Feels like old news for you, but yeah. But for our listeners, it might not be.
Yeah. So end of September was my official stepping down from Chief Creative Officer at Ocean Technologies Group after I can't say after 20 years, because OTG is only 5 years old. Is it 5? 20? Yeah, 2020 something. But yeah, so Ocean Technologies Group formed out of Videotel. I joined Videotel 2006, and so it was a sort of uninterrupted long journey, taking many kind of slightly different turns with different owners at different points and stuff like that. But yeah, and I've been there sort of as a constant all the way through. So yeah, it's come to an end.
What's your biggest takeaway from 20 years in a maritime training technology business?
My goodness me. I think it's what's the true success of it, and what was successful about it and what works about it. I would say it's about working in very close and trusted partnerships with your customers and involving your customers in what you're doing from a product perspective, but also how you're talking about what you do in a very close kind of way. Yeah. And I think it's when you leave a business like that after a length of time, I probably had as many customers reaching out to me as colleagues, who wanted to kind of talk about it or, have something
really nice
to say, so I think that's kind of really fantastic and really humbling and obviously, the point really. But I think that would be, that if I was to kind of think about one thing as being a big sort of takeaway, I think that's something that easily springs to mind. But obviously, I mean, so much has changed in the time that I've been working on that.
Yeah.
But also the different phases. Each one had, I think I would break them into the sort of Videotel period before when it was founder led under Stephen Bond and latterly Nigel Cleave. That was a very small, agile business with small business with in the sense that it was like sort of 50 people and then a few agents around the world supporting that as well. So it was a very small business with a very big responsibility, and that was also an interesting time because it was transforming from what was a media company into a technology company. And that's one of the reasons why I came in. And there were lots of teething things around that and lots of lessons to learn around that, around, how you think about what you do and how you set up your organization. It's a very different thing working on linear media to working on interactive software, and the whole business was engineered, in a certain way. So that was a fascinating kind of transformative period. Then it was sold to KVH, who were a SATCOMs provider, and suddenly that was a very different phase as well in so much as, suddenly finding out what it's like to work with the US company, which I hadn't done before, how to be, around the whole connectivity side of things, all the considerations around there. Met lots of very, very clever people, lots of different, opened up a lot of of things as well. And they were, they were also very supportive of me and put me into the position of running the video toll business in the end before it was then sold. And then obviously the 5 years was, like, if you want to sort of drew a curve, the last 5 years was the one where you're really learning, because so many different things to take on board, working under a completely different approach, private equity, working to to a very clear thesis, a merger, acquisitions of businesses, sort of leading a global team, much bigger team, but leading them through a period of change, and sort of, and a lot of it can be quite an emotional time as well, going through all of those sorts of things, and then getting through to the exit, and then becoming part of Lloyd's Register, from that was a year ago that the business was sold to them. So I think there's three kind of,
Wow.
three distinct phases, and all of them were sort of somewhat different in terms of, what I learned. But I think I'll give you my first answer. I think stands up as a kind of overall.
Yeah. And I guess probably quite after 20 years, quite a wrench to leave, but you're going on to do something which I think is A, very important, and B, quite exciting. So do you want to tell the listeners about Pitch Frame?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think a lot of people have kind of taken taken it perhaps not as I intended it to be. I don't know, really. I mean, look, when you do this, you kind of go like, well, I'm going to finish, and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do. I've got a few things kind of lined up that I want to work on. You need to just simply have a business that you can then, put invoices through and do that perfunctory stuff.
Yeah.
But of course, being me, I couldn't resist sort of making it. I didn't kind of go Raal Harris Consulting. There we go, and then I'll do a bit of because as a consultant as well, I think it's really important. You can't kind of say, well, I'm just going to do everything and anything. I'm not good at everything and anything, so you think about what it is that you can do, and then you kind of go, is this, I'll kind of put a bit of a brand around it. But I mean, it's essentially, it's me, right? So I'm the product, I guess. And, but I think the foundational thing around it is that it's, when I was running, main thing that I did at VideoTel was over most of that time was working on content and developing that content, and a lot of being out in the market talking about it and articulating the value proposition of it and stuff like that. So I wasn't really involved with marketing, but I was kind of telling stories around it, and I was kind of looking at that. And the thing about content is that because we were building stuff on like safety, on environment, on maritime law, and there were all these different sort of projects, you inevitably end up learning a lot about lots of different aspects of the industry. Now, what really changed was when we formed Ocean Technologies Group, brought in Manish, who you saw on the episode there, and Manish said to me, well, I want you to that was before we put the C-suite together. So he said, I just want you to be creative director. I want you to kind of create me a new brand, and want me to, handle all the marketing and all that sort of stuff. Make sure everyone understands what it is we're doing. That's, on paper, seemed like quite a big change, because it was, it was moving into a role that I hadn't done before or whatever. And I'd sort of seen, worked with marketing teams, but I hadn't really done anything as far as marketing was concerned. And it seemed like quite a big shift. And the reality was that it absolutely no shift whatsoever. It was 100% seamless. And it was because when you think about what's fundamental about education, you're trying to get people to understand concepts. You're trying to get them to be interested enough to kind of get through to it.
Yeah.
You're trying to transform how they think about a topic. And when you're doing something with brand, it's very, very similar. The emotional response you want someone to have, or at least you should be thinking about that and how you do it. And then and then in terms of like everything you're using to be able to do that, to take people on that, you're telling stories, you're creating, you're using every tool at your availability of media, of your ability to articulate and all that sort of stuff to generate that and to have that sort of impact. And then the third, there's like a third part to that wheel then, really, which is really about that transformation piece, about leading people through. So it's kind of an extension of marketing a little bit, and a bit about education as well, because it's about enablement internally within an organization, and how you actually then, get people to understand what it is that you want them to do, how you take them from being this company to the company of the future. And so those three things loosely, it's kind of about human enablement, training, learning development, brand development, and storytelling, and then internal kind of, organizational change. And those are the three things that I feel are where I can be differential. And so that's what I've kind of built that's the vehicle for Pitch Frame. And then, with Pitch Frame, it's really, the idea is just that I'll start to kind of pull together some of those threads a little bit, and make sure they're understood, I guess, or try to explain them a little bit more. So I'm putting up bits of content around it, but it's not something that I'm sort of actively, marketing. There isn't a product being developed or anything like that.
Yeah.
And people who want to utilize me and work with me on things that fit into those three areas that I talked about are really who I've been sort of talking to and lining things up. And I'm lined up, I've got something very, very exciting starting, which I'll be able to hopefully be able to talk about pretty soon. But yeah, that's really what it's about. But it's interesting because the way in which you kind of do it, a lot of people have been talking to me about it as if it's a company, like, fantastic, you're starting this. And I'm like, whoa, let's see how it goes,
I genuinely think so. Through Thetius, I have seen over the last 6 years thousands of potentially quote unquote game-changing technologies, right? And sometimes you genuinely see an idea and you think this has real industry transformation potential, and then you watch as the people who put that idea together just completely fail to articulate the value of it, and completely fail to communicate in a way that would drive someone to A, trust that this is a journey worth going on, and then B, actually go and take action towards it. And I think so many world-changing ideas are never come to fruition because of a lack of ability to get that strategic communications piece right, the people buy-in, the training, all of that, the organizational transformation. So genuinely, I really mean it when I say I think it's genuinely really important work, and I'm quite excited to see what you do over the next few months.
Yeah, thank you. And this is the problem, when you talk about it from a business. I'm very open about this when I talk to people. My concern is not that the need exists to do this work, right? I know it does. I've done it. I know what the difference is. The thing that worries me is that the number of people who actually would understand that you have to pay for that, right?
To pay for it, yeah.
It costs a lot of money to make things look easy. It's the same with events, right? I always make a point of spending time with the events people to thank them at the end. Because the thing I always say to all of them is, if we do our job, and because I also been in events, so I saw I know I've been in the trenches with them. If we do our job really, really well, no one will notice.
Yeah.
That's the point. The good stuff will happen because you set the mood, the stage. And it's very much like that, I think, with brand and with brand storytelling and all of that kind of thing. It's all of the subtle things that you can do to get people in the right frame of mind to hear that pitch and to understand what it is that's really good about what you do. And very often, the problem that you have when you're trying to talk to people about it is they don't understand that it's more about sculpture than it is about building something, right? You have to take stuff away and leave the gleaming beauty of the thing, right? Because it's not like I'm going to come in and I'm going to sit with you and I'm going to come up with something new that you've probably never talked about before, right? But I will give you the absolutely crystal thing that's super important and make sure that that's something that can then really shine and that kind of thing. So it's an art. These are fundamentally intangible things, but when it's right, you will succeed. And when it's wrong, you will fail. And I can't tell you necessarily why in the data, because it's not about that. It's too multifaceted where it comes from is this intrinsic thing about our decision-making process as humans. We are hardwired to go with our emotions. Why? Because we need to be able to be instinctive, to be able to survive. And that's our history. That's what's made us successful as a species. And so that's the thing where the real decisions are made before you ever get to the ability to really talk it through. And that's true of everything that you're doing, whether you're trying to sell a product, whether you're trying to get people in the right frame of mind to learn, whether you're trying to get people to embrace something that you're trying to do within your organization. If you don't get those emotional cues right, and you're not thinking about the individual's kind of how an individual is going to experience the information that you're giving to them, you will fail.
Yeah. We went through an exercise like that probably a couple of years ago that was a lot of stripping stuff back, and part of it was like a big strategic focus piece and making sure we're not doing things that we really don't want to be doing. But then once we got that dialed in and we really got the messaging right about it, it then just became like consistently repeating that message over and over again. We just wrapped up some stats for the last 12 months, and so I know this stat off the top of my head. Either myself or David, my managing director, my business partner, we've given the same presentation word for word 256 times in the last 12 months. And it's once we got that messaging right, we've just repeated it. And it's worked really well for us. And I think it's so easy to kind of drift through a lot of that stuff and not be intentional about it.
Well, yeah. And you see particularly see it with startups and people who are kind of getting to go because they realize they might not get in the room again. So they just, so they go for everything that might appeal to the person. And it's like, they're like sitting there, you're like kind of, as the person hearing the pitch, you're just like, well, hey, whoa, and it's the same thing. And to your point about repetition as well, this is something I learned in fire, right? Because I have a natural predisposition to getting bored and needing to move on, right? So I'll do something, I'll come up with something I'm really kind of happy with. We'll run that, campaign, or I'll talk about that at 2 conferences or something, and then I'll be like, no, I'm like Lady Gaga, it's time for my costume change, or like, no, I'm like David Bowie, I need to do a new kind of completely new look for the new album or something. I'm just obsessed with this idea that everyone's terrified of boring people, which may surprise people that I bore on a routinely basis, but I've always had that same thing. It's been before I came into Maritime. The problem is that people haven't had a chance to really experience or enjoy what you're doing, number one, Number two, even if they've heard it, they probably were doing something else and they didn't, they're not going to get bored of it that quickly. And you can sometimes end up surrendering, and your competition will pick that up because they'll go, oh, he's not using that anymore, and that was really good. I'll go for that now, and we'll own that bit. And it could be that bit's really foundational and stuff. So, but the repetition thing is really, really important. And it's about that thing where I think where you get that's what I mean about like the sculpture thing, just chip everything else away and leave the thing that's really important. There's maybe 3-4 things people are actually going to remember and take away from it. And most of what we're doing as well, like this is Maritime. You are not going to clinch a deal. No one's going to go out and whip the credit card and buy what you're doing straight away, right? It's going to take time. The one thing you need to do is start a conversation. So you just need to have enough to make them kind of go, okay, I'll have a demo, or I'll take a call, or come and see us. And, so just, that's the bit. But it's hard. I know. I can imagine, when you think you might never get to see that person and you want to give them that full pitch. But it like I said, it's born out of personal experience, about fire. And I'll give you a very good idea, a very good thing about that, a very good example of that is when we were trying to move VideoTel to kind of make people understood, that when I joined in 2006, I think I'd even did a couple of freelance projects before that, but they'd already been doing kind of interactive stuff for something like about 8 years or something. Okay. And about 8 years later, people would still say, oh yeah, you do video, don't you? People just, once they think of you in that way, it's like, of course the name didn't help, VideoTel. This is again where brands can be, and we, in the end, I can probably say this now, it's long enough in the future. In the end, just realized that we just needed to do something really kind of to move the dial and to change people to thinking of us about a technology company. And that's when VR just landed in my lap, and I just went, give me some money. We won't make any money with VR. We're not going to really make any money with VR, but we will make everyone think of us.
People will think we're a technology company.
Because no one else was doing it. You could do something very eye-catching. You'd walk past the stand. This was 2017. We got the first one at Crew Connect, first set at Crew Connect. I did that pilot. I think I spent about £10,000, on that pilot. And it got everyone talking, and it did the job. People started to think about it as the technology company. So, changing the conversation is kind of is an art form. And to come back to the spend, I think the other point I wanted to make about the spend, and this is nothing to do with events. I'm not down on events, but events is a great example. A lot of people spend money in marketing on the big things that are really unavoidably expensive, like having a stand at Posidonia or something, right? But if you haven't got all your fundamental stuff right, you're just wasting all of that money. So you're much better off taking some of that spend where you're doing some pretty crazy stuff and saying, let's just do some really good foundational things. And then everything else will come from that. But, it's
So without making this entirely a shameless plug episode, that's a big part of why commissioning research is really powerful, because it gives you that centerpiece. For the next 12, 18 months, it gives you that kind of centerpiece piece of content that you can hang everything else off. And it makes those other investments more worthwhile when you go and do the big shows and the conferences and stuff.
Well, yeah. And we can turn this into a Meet the Customer episode, Nick. I was a customer of yours for this very reason. No, absolutely. Content can be big ticket items, right? But they do enable storytelling. Having data gives you a story to tell. Being able to build that thought leadership and that presence. Very good example that's not Theseus, and so people won't accuse us of just plugging. There are lots of maritime charities. They all do very good work. They will all publish bits of research from time to time. Seafarers Happiness Index for the mission seafarers works really well. Why? Because it's a consistent temperature check on the seafarer community. And what happens is every time you and I or anybody else is invited on a panel to talk about seafarers, they'll go through that thought process, and they'll say, well, how can I should really kind of make it kind of current to something. I know, I'll have a look at the Seafarers Happiness Index. So then they go on stage and they come out with, well, in the latest version of the Seafarers Happiness Index. So 100% research is, like I said, the thing about data, and you and I talked about this a lot, data is really not that interesting. The stories you can tell off the back of the data is what makes it really interesting. It's one of those things that is really important from a brand point of view if you're commissioning this kind of thing, because you understand how it's going to collect and connect and amplify and explain your brand, and you're right to be either to take it. Sometimes you can use it to establish that mandate, and sometimes it's that you need it to unearth and to make people understand that you are the authority on it, and both are perfectly fine, and in terms of how you do it. But if you don't understand how it really connects your brand, because if you don't understand what it is where your real value is, you might miss opportunities elsewhere that really connect to that. When I'm talking about coming out of my last 20 years, there was a very big shift when we sort of realized that we were actually a human capital management company. And once we did that, it was like, well, then we probably need to kind of start to talk about that and build that authority. And then that's when we did the report with you on that very basis, and it worked.
Great book called Play Bigger, which is on exactly this topic. So it's on the topic of category design, basically. How do you, rather than try and fit into someone else's category, how do you create an entirely new category for what you do? And it's sort of, the argument is like the iPhone, has 50-60% market share of smartphone handsets because they created the smartphone category. Airbnb has 50-60% of the home sharing market. Uber, all of these companies that actually created categories of their own. And how do you go about that? Really, yes, it's a great read. Well, definitely recommend to people.
Yeah, and that's really that's sort of why I talk about what I'm trying to do, or what I'm trying to wrap my thing up in, is kind of creative strategy, really, because that's the point, really, that you're looking at things and seeing where is forget the labels, forget those kind of structures. They're not helpful because they won't help you to see what's actually really kind of shifting and changing. And that's where opportunities really kind of appear. And I think you can actually see a few businesses or unwittingly, I don't want to mention them here. They might thank me or they might not. So I'll err on the side of caution. But there are some brands that I've been talking to, and some companies where I've been sort of trying to kind of give them a few perspectives on that, because I think they are in a new category. that's much more interesting than the one that they think they're in, and that I think has more
Yeah.
kind of legs, and things are opening up. And one really good example of that is something that I'm very interested in, is that sort of, where training meets that sort of in-work enablement kind of thing. And I think that will kind of really have some really interesting things going on as well. That was, I wasn't expecting that, but that was quite a diverting chat.
It was a bit, wasn't it? That's all right.
I was in Maritime Cyprus this week.
Yeah, how was it?
It was a very short visit for me. I missed the sort of opening day. Managed to catch some of the sessions in the conference itself, but one of the sessions that I think, well, one of the reasons that it was interesting is the session that I joined on the ship owners one, and we've definitely got to talk about this: the way in which the ship owners are talking about energy transition now, and the way in which that conversation is developing. And a really good quote from Polis Hadjianu, who's from CEO of Safe Bulkers. They were talking about methanol vessels, and at the time, and he says, "We knew more in 2023 than we know now." It just kind of was kind of throwaway comment there, mate.
That is good.
It gave a minute, and then there was like this little ripple of laughter that kind of then went back from him. He's very, very dry sense of humor, the guy, but I thought it was a really interesting way of framing it. And there was a lot of fear, a lot of people talk. There is clear anxiety about stranded assets, a lot about uncertainty that we've talked about before, and was another one of the speakers on the group that I haven't met before. It was a very sort of engaging guy, Philippos Efstafiou, who's the CEO of FNAV. He was very engaging, but he said basically, if he had to make a decision today, he would go for conventional fuel.
Really?
So there's still this kind of level of uncertainty.
That's a good way to tease what I think we will have to find time to discuss next week, which is that the MEPC, the Marine Environment Protection Committee at the IMO, is meeting next week for a pretty major vote on decarbonisation policy. And we were debating whether to discuss it this week. And I don't think we've got time because it's such a big topic. So I think we should, as soon as the outcome of that is known, I think we need to have a special.
Well, I think
about it.
Yes and no. I agree. We have left it too late, but I just wanted to make two interesting observations and then maybe get into this. One of the things that was really interesting was that everybody is now much more evangelistic about energy saving measures. So when it comes to the modifications that can be made to vessels, to operational initiatives and so on, and it's really good, because this has been one of the things that's really annoyed me. We talked about, that's kind of where I was going with that strictly decarb thing when we were talking about that a while ago. It was just like where there's a fuel uncertainty, but you can get so much improvement out of it. 20-fold was the figure that was quoted in terms of improvements around energy efficiency. And so, in other words, huge amount of things to be proud about. Now, the reason that this is getting so pointy, as you said, Nick, is this vote that's going to be next week. So I just want to it's going to be high drama, the Marine Environment Protection Committee meeting, which is happening next week, or maybe this week, depending on when this episode goes out. Now, we don't know exactly when, and we don't know exactly whether it will need to go to a vote. It seems likely that it will. But I think there are a few things that we could maybe just help. I think you're right. It would be good to get into it after the event and talking about what comes out of it. But these are the kind of things that we need to be looking at. There's a number of things which will be contentious next week. And the first thing to say is, well, if it goes to a vote, they need a 2/3 majority. Okay. So, but there have been specifically, the US has been the big ones that have been threatening, I think, even retaliatory measures if other people vote in the way that they don't want to go with this. There is the response of this, just not to panic people, but this could be reciprocal measures. It could be trade tariffs. It could be, port, even visa things have been touted as potential problems with it. And there are other people saying that it's too much of what they're being asked to vote on is not clear. Okay. That seems to be, and this got very heated in the comments to the presenters from the floor. From some, from not just from owners, from people from classification societies, lots of other people who are sort of deep in the detail of this, who feel very uneasy about it. Now, you might say, well, why is this? What's the real crunch point? And I think if we maybe make it easy for people by looking at it, you've got those who are saying that it's not ready, it's not clear enough. There are some points of detail around the carbon pricing mechanism. So the way that the units and stuff are going to be looked at there. Obviously, there's some stuff in there around the carbon intensity standard from well to wake. The way in which we look at the fuel, really depending about the acceptability of the fuels and so on. There is looking at that full life cycle emissions of how those are then calculated and all that sort of stuff. So quite often, well to wake is the best way of talking about that. So it's not just kind of what happens when you put it in the engine and blow it up the stack. Where does that kind of come from? So there's some stuff around there. There's the other thing in there is about it. I'm trying to remember what they called it now. I maybe made a sort of a note around it, but it's about there's similar things around the vessels themselves and around how we kind of look at the life cycle of vessels, and that's obviously very important when it comes to things like the ship owners are very agitated about, because they are looking for at least 25 years in most cases of being able to sweat their asset that they create as well. So there's and again, you're right, we don't have the time, but there's a number of like points of detail. But I think what it really comes down to is to whether or not people can accept and move forward with some of the ambiguity that exists there in favor of the certainty of the mechanism being in place. Because the alternative is if let's say it goes to a vote and the vote doesn't get the majority, the real fear there is really two things. One, more inertia, more, lack of investment, all of those things. That lack of certainty means that people won't start pushing the button on lots of things that they, once they have that certainty. We've talked about that before in the past, that the sort of the money, the funding, all of those kinds of things is going to be determined on the outcome of this. So fundamentally, if we don't get a decision, that decision gets delayed. We're losing time that we don't have. And then the other thing that I think is that I would really like everybody to really focus on again is this fear of fragmentation. Okay. Like if the IMO can't bring this together globally, get everybody focused, a level playing field. I caveat that by saying some of the people's objections are that it's not a level playing field with what they're being asked to vote on. So it's not as clear cut as you might hope. Then different states will start to do it. The EU, as we know, already have EU ETS, Fuel EU, these kind of measures. Other people will start doing. It becomes a hodgepodge of all these. And I've said it before, the reason that most of us can be successful in this business is because of the globally agreed standards and the ability. It's a global trade. If we had to start to deal with lots of different fragmentations, I think it's a real concern. And I think one of the things that, that we're seeing is that globalization, talked about it up front, is playing an even further part in this, because you've got all these different people that are being asked to vote on these measures. They're not looking at it globally because they have interests within their own countries, their own people that they're representing, who may have different interests, different ways of thinking about it. So that pull that we've seen, or that sort of, that's the old order destabilization that we've been seeing, is playing into this now. But of course, I just urge everyone to think about the fact that the planet is one thing, right? It's one planet. We need one solution for this. And that's where I think the biggest problem that we have in the face of the vote next week is that shipping is actually doing more to collectively try and organize on this than everybody else.
And if it passes, it will be the first global mechanism that's been put in place across any industry that's legally binding. And so it's a major milestone, not just for the industry, but for the entire planet, if it passes. And it's still a bit of an if. Definitely something to keep an eye on next week.
Yeah, well, I'll be glued. Yeah, I'll be glued to it. And I really wish all of our friends there the best.
Best of luck.
I think I hear all the points of view. I think the thing for me is uncertainty will not be helpful, and I'd like to see some resolution, but that's just my view.
Yeah.
Good.
Well, on that happy note.
All right, cool. Well, look, let's call it a day.
Go on.
There's been a lot of talk about early on about having a good sign off, wasn't there?
Oh yeah, have you got one?
Well, yeah, mainly born out of necessity, because our subscriber count is going up very, very nicely.
It is.
but I still want more people out there. I'm still very hungry for that, for knowing that audience is there. So what seems to be differentiating our little podcast is people seem to like the sort of, the irreverent, slightly unprofessional vibe, the sort of the informalness of it. So
this makes me nervous about what's coming.
No, it's very simple, Nick. If you like the vibe, please subscribe.
Look at that. That's beautiful. I like it. Yeah. All right.
Wherever you get your
like the vibe,
podcasts.
please subscribe.
If you like the vibe. So
On
there
that
you go.
note,
Yeah.
have a great week, everyone.
Bye.